Thank you so much for joining us today to Meetup Live. My name is Janine Miatan, and for those of you that don't know, I've moderated these conversations before. I'm the event programming manager at Meetup, and I am so honored to be joined by our two special guests today, Luke Wall, Executive Director of Only 7 Seconds, and Abraham Sculley of Speaker Inspire. We're going to have a conversation about suicide prevention and hear about situational warning signs, how to spot them so that you can intervene appropriately and get advice on starting these conversations and asking the right questions to steer someone towards safety. I also just want to say before we get started, I just wanted to do a trigger warning. We will be talking about some stuff that might be triggering. So just, if you need to bow out, don't worry. We will also record this event, able to access the recording of this event, but just wanted to share that with everyone. Before we started, I am going to go over some guidelines, and then I'm going to go over the agenda. I just froze for a second. So this event is being recorded, as I mentioned, sharing a recording of this event in our blog at meetup.com/blog, as well. The recording will also be on YouTube, and do not worry, you will not appear on video. It is just the three of us. And as a mute courtesy, your audio is going to be muted throughout the entirety of the event. We'll be hearing the three of us. We also encourage you to please submit your questions. There is a feature at the bottom of the screen. Please go ahead and submit your questions, and we will do our best to get through as many as possible during the Q&A session at the end of the event. There is also closed captioning available. Thank you to Zoom. There is a button at the bottom of your screen, but to turn it on, you can just click on the live transcription icon and select your preference. So I am going to introduce our two guests. Then they're going to share a couple of slides, and then we are going to get into the Q&A. So as I mentioned, if you have questions, which we do encourage you to ask them, please just submit them in the Q&A feature. You can see the icon at the bottom of your screen. Okay, so I'm going to introduce both of our guests. So I'm going to start with Luke, as I mentioned earlier, is the Executive Director of Only 7 Seconds. It's a nonprofit of a world without loneliness. After the corporate industry, Luke transitioned to work at Special Olympics, where he saw firsthand the effects of social isolation in the intellectual disability community, especially during COVID. In 2018, after a family member experienced social isolation that led to depression, Luke's mother started Only 7 Seconds. In 2020, after 2 local youth suicides, Luke began leading Only 7 Seconds. Since then, Luke has developed a passion for tackling loneliness and its harmful effects on whole person health. Only 7 Seconds creates to address lonely youth, communities, and individuals. Thank you for joining us, Luke.
Thanks so much. Excited to be here.
And then our other guest, Abraham Sculley. He is the founder of Speaks to Inspire, also a best-selling author, podcaster, advocate, and active mind speaker to eradicate mental health stigma. He developed a passion for mental health from his battle with depression during college. Shortly after, Abraham received his degree in psychology and set on a mission to impact audiences across the country by sharing his story. He has collaborated with many organizations to create safe spaces for honest conversations about mental health and illness. Today, he partners with higher education leaders, school professionals, and student leaders to support young adult and mental health and well-being. So before we dive into the conversation, I just kind of want to add some context to everything that we're going to be talking about. Abraham and Luke are both going to be sharing some slides, and they're just going to talk a little bit about the statistics in regards to mental health and suicide. Abraham, go ahead.
Absolutely. Thank you, Janine. Thank you, Meetup, for hosting this space. I think it's always a benefit where we have these spaces to have such honest conversations, because we all have mental health and we all are affected in some capacity as it relates to conditions and even suicide. So thank you for creating this space. As you can see on the slides, just a few statistics here for you to look at and be mindful of But the first thing I think is critical to note is that suicide does not discriminate. I think oftentimes we think about, those who are affected by suicide, those who die by suicide, it looks a certain way. It has a certain face or a certain experience, which then leads to suicide. But suicide doesn't discriminate, based on it. It doesn't matter, an individual's, age, their socioeconomic status, their influence, how much money they have in the bank. Anyone can be affected by either suicidal thoughts or suicidality and can ultimately die by suicide. A few statistics here to also mention, suicide was the second leading cause of death for people ages 10 to 14 and 25 to 34. So if we think about those affected by suicide as young as 10 years old, right? And so the more we can understand and normalize a conversation about suicide, we can ultimately prevent these cases of suicide. Another statistic that you can see here on the screen is 3.2 million adults made a plan to complete suicide. And I think, what is important to think about is there is a difference between having thoughts of suicide and having a plan. And then even to go further, having the means to follow through with that plan. One thing that I like to share with individuals, and just as a note as well, I'm a suicide prevention gatekeeper instructor with the QPR Institute. If you're not familiar with the QPR Institute, great resource to look into. And one thing I like to share in the trainings that I facilitate is that it's actually very common to have thoughts of suicide. It's actually kind of common to have thoughts of death. If you even, think back on your own life's experience and a time maybe where you were having a difficult experience in your life, a difficult, season, and you had this thought. It was a random thought. It came and it went. And because we don't understand how common it is to have thoughts about suicide, we shy away from even having the conversation. And so there are people who are having the thoughts and may not have a plan, may not have a desire or even the means to complete suicide, but the thoughts are there. And yet we're not having the conversation. So the more we can normalize these conversations to say, I've had thoughts, or I have been affected, I think it helps us to lead towards ultimately preventing suicide, because suicide is the most preventable death, like hands down, point blank. And there are things that we can apply. There are tools and strategies that we can learn to help to prevent suicide. But if we think about it, it's one of the most or the most preventable deaths. And we all play a role in ultimately preventing it. So thanks so much for sharing that slide, Janine. I'll hand it back over to you.
Yeah, thank you for all of, and I'm so grateful for this conversation that we're going to have today, because we're going to talk about some tools and some resources to do just that, prevent suicide. These numbers are astronomical, and it's unfathomable that this is such a reality. And it's also devastating. We're going to go ahead and share a slide that Luke will speak on.
Yeah, so thank you for having me, Meetup, and Janine. Abraham, it's great to be here with you. And it's a perfect transition where Abraham kind of landed the plane there, just talking about prevention. And when we started Only 7 Seconds and in the early stages of our organization, suicide was a really direct correlation into the work we were doing. And when we started to map out what is it that we wanted to do as an organization, we had a lot of conversation around how do we get further upstream in the conversation around mental health versus being just preventing suicide as it's happening, but rather how do we start to build skill sets and resiliency and different things around addressing prevention at a far further point upstream than what might be available. And so as we started to have those conversations, we really started to learn and understand the topic of loneliness. And I'll start here of just talking about what is loneliness, and then I'll share a little bit about why loneliness and suicide and what the correlation is there. loneliness is the feeling of being alone, whether your need for social connection is not being met. Every single person listening to this, Abraham, Janine, myself, there isn't one person that hasn't experienced the pain of feeling lonely, whether it was sitting at a playground in second grade and you didn't have a friend, to right now you are home alone and don't have someone to be close with. Those feelings of loneliness are common. They are one of the key factors that we all share in human experience. We also have the human experience of needing human connection. And so as we started to just learn and understand more about loneliness, research started to come out over the last 5 to 6 years that really started to emphasize the impact of loneliness on whole person health and especially mental health. And what was being found is that there's a direct tie between loneliness and especially suicide, but all sorts of physical and mental health challenges. And so as we start to dive into this conversation about and focus the conversation around suicide, I just want to explain that there is a really complex correlation between loneliness and suicide. Not every person feeling lonely is going to be suicidal or experience suicidal ideation. And we know that loneliness doesn't always play a role in someone's decision to end their own life. But on a general population level, we know there's a strong association between suicide and loneliness. The rates of suicide and suicidal ideation increase when someone feels lonely, or loneliness is really heightened. Put another way, loneliness is seen as a significant predictor in suicidal ideation and behavior. And so with kind of that point, the last thing I'll just say is that loneliness, I said it was really prevalent, that you might think about loneliness really, if you were to imagine what the most, the population that might experience loneliness the most, you might imagine elderly people, people that might be in group homes or things like that. But the reality is it's actually Gen Zers. Ages 12 to 24 are the highest rate of loneliness at almost 80% across the US. And that goes back to Abraham's point about youth, even as young as 10 years old, experiencing suicide. And so this is really something as an organization and for my own personal passion that it really starts with youth, and addressing loneliness and suicide even at those young ages is super, super important. So I'm super excited for this conversation and just appreciate the time that I have here today to talk more about this.
Thank you so much, Luke. Wow. Yeah, over here at Meetup, the loneliness epidemic is also something that's very important to us. We definitely want to combat. We want people to feel connected and to be a part of a community. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and dive into the questions. Y'all shared a little bit, about what your organizations do and touched on your experience. But just if you can just dive a little deeper into share your stories as to why you became so passionate about mental health. Either one of you can go first. I mean, I always do alphabetical order. Go with Abraham.
Okay, I could do it. Yeah, so such a great question. And I think even with the question, it's important to note we all have a story, especially surrounding the conversation of mental health. So my story is I grew up in a Jamaican household, 2 Jamaican immigrant parents, also a very religious household. And there were a lot of lessons that I learned from my upbringing and a lot of values that I was able to grasp and utilize, even till now. But one of the challenges that I realized growing up in that environment, in Miami as well, is that we didn't have conversations about mental health. We didn't have conversations about our emotions, our feelings, how to seek support. And so there was this very interesting understanding and dynamic around when you deal with anything that is unseen, you either don't talk about it, or you pray about it, or you ignore it, or you do more so that you don't have to sit with it. And I carried that on until, my adulthood. So I was the first in my family to go off to college. I ended up moving 700 miles away from home to go to school. And as a first generation student, I experienced some mental health challenges. I didn't know what mental health was. I didn't know what mental illness was. And so as I was going through these health challenges, I did what I saw. So a couple of things that I saw is, if you're challenged with certain things, you work more, you put more on your plate, you act like it's not happening, you motivate yourself out of it. And I did that until it didn't work anymore. And about 8 years ago, I had a conversation with a best friend of mine that changed my life. I remember being in the apartment or the bedroom of my apartment, and I was really struggling mentally. Like, Luke mentioned earlier, dealing with loneliness, isolating myself, withdrawing from things that I enjoyed, people that I loved. And I had a phone call, and this friend, checked in on me because she saw the signs, and she checked in and she asked, how are you doing? Is everything okay? And after really dancing around the conversation, because it was something that I had never talked about before, I finally opened up with her and shared that, I wasn't feeling motivated. I was having negative racing thoughts that were keeping me up at night. I wasn't eating. I didn't have an appetite. And from sharing these things in a very intimate conversation with my best friend, I was able to get it out, and she was able to share support with me. So she ended up, encouraging me to see a counselor. And I saw a counselor and was later diagnosed with major depressive disorder, and went on this long journey of being treated and recovering. But in that process of recovery, I started to open up about my experience, in one-on-one conversations with friends and family members. And what I found is that there were a lot of people who looked like me and shared similar experiences, who were also dealing with mental health challenges, but no one was talking about it. It seemed as if there was this idea that when we're suffering with anything that we can't see, we have to do it in silence. And so I made it, my mission and a huge project that plays a big role in my life to work towards reducing and ultimately eradicating the stigma that exists. And that actually birthed what is now Speaks to Inspire, the company I founded. We're the mental health solution for young adults suffering in silence. And the goal really is to create these safe spaces where young people feel comfortable to talk about things that they're experiencing, but then also making the mental health resources accessible, those that exist. So that's how I got into the work. And what encourages me today is continuing to see how, by sharing our story, it opens up a space that allows others to share and even get the support that they need.
So much for sharing your story. Sorry, Luke, before we move on to you, I just wanted, so I'm going to share a little bit about my story. About 20 years ago, I was diagnosed with depression and anxiety. My experience was a little different than yours in the sense I did try to share with, people that I knew what was happening and how I was feeling. I wasn't sure what was wrong, but I knew that something was wrong and something didn't feel right. And I repeatedly kept on getting the same response. Oh, but you're young. You have your whole life ahead of you. You have so much going for you. How could you be depressed? Why would you be sad? No, 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 no. You should put a smile on your face and just be grateful for everything that you have. And that was really difficult to digest because on top of feeling depressed and sad, then I also felt in so much shame for feeling the way that I felt when, I had so much that had been given to me and I wasn't on, and it seemed like I was ungrateful for it. And just like you, I tell everyone and anyone that's willing to listen, my story, because it is very important for everyone to share their story. And it's so powerful. We need to break down the stigma. Otherwise, these tragedies are continue to happen. People will continue to suffer in silence. Sorry, go ahead, Luke.
No, don't be sorry. I super appreciate that. And just the vulnerability and the ability to share your own story is just so important. And it plays such a role in the conversation around just Abraham, you said this at the beginning. Suicide doesn't discriminate, right? And mental health challenges don't discriminate. And it does, like, it doesn't matter how rich or poor, how famous or insignificant you may feel, like all of that, like how you look, how you act, doesn't matter, right? Like at the end of the day, like anyone can experience mental health challenges. And that's why we see celebrities that choose to take their own lives. And we say, why does that happen when it seems like they have everything put together, right? And it doesn't discriminate. And so I really appreciate the vulnerability. No need to apologize. And in fact, that's kind of part of my story and how I got involved in this. My mom started this organization. My background is, funny enough, in business. It's not even in the mental health space originally. And I've leaned into this because I know people that have had extreme mental health challenges. I know people who have taken their own lives. It became a personal passion of mine when two boys, I still get choked up talking about it. Two boys within 2 weeks of each other chose to take their own lives here in the town that I grew up in. Both two small towns, 600 people and less than 2,000 people, a couple miles apart. And they were the boys that had it, right? Like it was, in those cases, it was the person that you least expected it from. It was the people that had their life in front of them, and they were sports superstars, and they were athletes, they had the girlfriends, they had the families, they had it all. And so I got involved in this because I have had situations where our mission is, it takes only 7 seconds to check in on someone and see how they're doing, to dial a phone number and say, how are you doing? Or I care about you, and hit send, or you dial a phone number and you hit send. If anyone listening takes that time, it takes about 7 seconds to do one of those things. And I have had people cry on my shoulders and say, I wish so-and-so would have taken 7 seconds and just reached out to me. I know people whose lives are saved because a 7-second text that said, hey, can we get ice cream right now? They were in the process of choosing to end their own life in that moment. And those 7 seconds saved lives. And so that's where, like, I've just seen time and time again, these simple little connections, these simple little moments. The more I can just advocate for that, Abraham, you said it's the most preventable thing on when it comes to death. And I think that's probably true. And I've seen that firsthand. Right. And so that's why I do this. And that's a little bit of my background, but just sharing why I'm passionate about it.
It's incredible that 7 seconds, right? Yeah. 7 seconds. Such a big impact on some. I mean, it really is life or death.
Yeah.
That number, it's incredible. So Abraham, this question is for you. Is there a correlation between mental illness and suicide? And can you be suicidal and not have a mental illness?
Yes, so I'll start with the second question. Yes, you can be suicidal and not have a mental illness. And I think it's important to even define mental illnesses or mental health disorders. And the simplest way that I like to define it is that it is a health condition that affects the way you think, the way you feel, and the way you behave. And oftentimes when we think about mental illness or even mental health, it's almost as if we see it as the same thing. But there's a difference between mental health and mental illness, but also understanding that mental illness is a health condition. So it's not a character flaw. It's not that there's something wrong with your ability to perform. It's none of those things that bring on the shame or the guilt around mental illness. It's a health condition. So, things like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress disorders. These are all different forms of mental illness, and mental illness can be very complex. So as it relates to the question, having a mental illness can increase the likelihood of someone dying by suicide, but that isn't the case in all cases. There are many individuals who do have mental health conditions, mental illness, and live with mental illness who don't die by suicide. And so I think although the risk can be higher, because if we're thinking about, I'll put it in personal terms for myself. I mentioned I was diagnosed with depression. And I dealt with a mental health challenge that I didn't know anything about. So it was affecting the way that I was thinking. Depression made me think that this would never get better. The way I was feeling, I would have to get used to this. It made me think that I was not important. I was not significant. It made me think that others didn't love me, right? And those thoughts affected the way that I felt. I felt helpless about my situation because I was thinking things are never going to get better. What's the purpose of even trying? Because this is what my life is going to look like. So I felt helpless. I also felt hopeless, right? I was looking for things to get better and they weren't getting better. And that affected the way that I behaved. So I started isolating myself. I started withdrawing myself from family, from friends, things that I enjoyed. And a part of that, those thinking, and feelings and behaviors, it can lead someone to think that, well, if I'm in this state of mind and these thoughts are telling me these things, then suicide will ultimately end the pain that I'm experiencing, will ultimately end the feelings that come with having a mental illness, but it doesn't have to. So it's very complex. And I think it's important to note that there are situational factors that can happen where someone doesn't have to have a mental illness to think about suicide or even die by suicide. For example, if someone has a spouse that they've been with for, decades, and they lose that person that they love, right? After losing that person that they love, because that person plays such a significant role in their lives, that person now doesn't believe that their life has significance without this person. Now, that person may not have a mental illness or is diagnosed with any mental health condition, but because a specific situation, happened that causes them to think, I no longer want to live and it would be better off if I'm gone. So yes, having a mental illness can be a risk factor for someone dying by suicide, but it's not always the case. And individuals who do die by suicide, they don't always have a mental illness.
Thank you for that answer, Abraham. Luke, would you like to add anything?
No, again, Abraham's the expert here, so I'll defer to him on that answer.
I have to say, I really do appreciate your responses, Abraham, because you're not placing blame on anyone, right? And your responses are so thoughtful and just so compassionate, which it's something that so many people lack, when dealing with folks that do have mental health conditions. And so another question that I wanted to ask
Can
you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just want to say thank you for saying that, but also I think because of the shame and stigma surrounding mental health and mental illness, we tend to forget that it is a part of the human experience. But then also going back to mental illness is a health condition. If we look at a friend, a family member who was, God forbid, diagnosed with cancer, we're not going to treat that person as if they have something wrong with them or they should feel bad or feel shame for this diagnosis that they receive. But because when it comes to mental health conditions, we can't see it, right? It looks like, quote unquote, someone is being lazy. It looks like someone is not performing, or is unmotivated, whatever the case is. And we treat them as such without the compassion, without the sympathy, without recognizing that this is a health condition. Just like if someone broke their ankle, and we're going to, give compassion, we're going to give support, we're going to take them to where they need to go to get, whatever support they need, is the same way we should treat others with mental health conditions. So just wanted to add that piece to it.
Thank you. No, I really appreciate that. Okay, so what are some influential factors that can lead someone to have thoughts? As you mentioned, most people have them. What are some factors that can lead to that? Either one of you.
I'll defer to Abraham to start, and then I'll color it afterwards.
Sure. So I mentioned there are situational factors that definitely play a role. So for someone whose identity is tied up in their work, and then they ultimately get fired, or they're no longer able to work anymore. That can be a factor that causes them to think, well, life is no longer worth living. That can be one. And then there are other factors that, are surrounding even mental illness, like I mentioned, earlier, can be a risk factor, because if we think about mental illness, it affects the way you think, right? And I wrote a book, and I'm sure we can talk about it a little bit later, but I wrote a book called Unlearn the Lies, a guide to reshaping the way we think about depression. And in the book, I highlight 7 specific lies that many people tell themselves when dealing with a mental health condition. And it is those lies that perpetuate and cause us to believe that life is no longer worth living. It's the misconceptions, things like, if I'm depressed, then I'm weak. Or if I am not able to motivate myself out of bed, then I don't deserve to live. I don't deserve to progress in life. So there are multiple factors that exist that can cause someone to be thinking about ending their life. And I think it's important just to recognize, how different events in our life affect us emotionally, and even affect others, that we love and care about emotionally, so that we know when and how to support those people.
Yeah, the other thing that I would just add, as far as some of the risk factors, I think I'd be remiss not to touch on the correlation again between lack of human connection or lack of belonging, finding places where you can be vulnerable. People that are the most isolated, generally that is a higher risk factor. People that are, Abraham, in your example of your own personal life story, if you hadn't had a friend checking in on you and being there for you and encouraging you to approach counseling and all of those things, you would have been a higher risk factor for continued suicidal thoughts, right? Like that would have continued to increase. And so that's another significant risk factor, is just lack of places of belonging, lack of meaningful relationship. Those are really significant factors as well.
So, okay, and I'm kind of veering off topic here, off the script, but so I guess then, how do you find, these meaningful relationships, right? I think super important, right? Like, how can you start to be vulnerable, in these relationships? Like, how vulnerable you can be, how honest you can be about what you're feeling?
Yeah, there's a couple of questions there. So one, where do you find the places to do that? I'll plug, and you're gonna share this at the end. There's a lot of resources on Only 7 Seconds website now. We actually have a guide to I Know Lonely. It's if you're experiencing loneliness, where to find connection. And there's a lot of recommendations within that of spaces for meaningful connection and relationship. Oftentimes, one of the factors that you might think is that you need a lot of different relationships. The reality is it's oftentimes one relationship. Abraham, in your example, I'm going to keep leaning in on that, but like, it wasn't 20 friends that rallied around you in that scenario. It was one person. It was one meaningful relationship. And so it's oftentimes finding that one meaningful relationship where you can find the space to be vulnerable and have a meaningful conversation. The next question is then, where do you find that space to have that vulnerable conversation? And that's a little bit tougher, right? I think that is where it's a really individualized to the person situation, where it takes time, and it's not always on the first time you meet someone that you're going to share your entire life experience. And it doesn't happen overnight that Abraham is now sharing his own experience about depression with an audience of over 1,000 listening. That doesn't happen overnight. It happened in one space with a friend that he felt very comfortable with, that he already had a pre-established relationship with. And that takes some time to build that trust. And so it takes time to build that relationship and build friendship and build trust. And that happens oftentimes not overnight. It takes some time to be able to do that. So that's not a direct answer to your question. If there's a more dire need that's more immediate, that's where it's really where I would recommend that you find counseling, that you find a space where it is someone that's trained, and that it's going to continue to be a private conversation, that you can trust someone who's trained in a situation. More broadly speaking, it's more on my end of just saying build relationship over time.
That's so good. One thing I like to share, I think it ties in well with what you're talking about, Luke, is I love to share that it's important to be hot. And there's this principle that I came up with a few years ago. And so hot is actually an acronym. Y'all are gonna
Okay.
love this, right? So HOT stands for being honest, being open, and transparent. And I'm gonna break it down. But to kind of, speak on your first question, Janine, I think it really takes a perspective shift for us as individuals. That perspective shift must happen for us to then say, being honest, creating meaningful relationships is a good thing. Because I think oftentimes when we think about the word vulnerable, we don't have positive words to say about being vulnerable. And not many of us are actually practicing vulnerability, but vulnerability is courage. And vulnerability is a good thing. And that's the only way we can build relationships, and have those meaningful connections. And it's not until we shift our perspective to see that it is positive and it is powerful and it is great to be vulnerable, we won't take the steps to be hot, right? So being hot, H is being honest. So that's when you tune in and develop that self-awareness. So you're recognizing the feelings and emotions that you experience. So I take myself through this really quick exercises. I ask myself, how have I been thinking lately? How have I been feeling lately? How have I been behaving lately? And for most of us, especially on this call, you probably have a lot going on. You're doing a lot, and we don't take as much time as we could to tune in, to check in with ourselves. So being honest is really about tuning in with myself and accepting this is where I am in this moment, right? So if I wake up, one morning and I didn't have a good night's, sleep, I'm not going to lie to myself and say, I'm great, everything is fine, going after the day. Now I'm going to tune in and say, this is how I'm feeling this morning. And how can I navigate throughout the day based on the feelings and emotions that I experience to get the most out of the day. Being open is when we're open to new experiences, but also recognizing that change is inevitable. I think for the typical human being, we like things to be pretty consistent. We don't like change. And we have to embrace change. We have to have that openness to experience something new. So back to my personal experience, I mentioned I grew up in a Jamaican household, in a very religious household. And I'm not sure if anyone can resonate with that experience, but no one went to counseling in my family. No one talked about going and receiving any type of mental health support. So for me to even engage in that, I had to be open. I had to open my mind to say, well, this has never been done before. I haven't seen it been done before. This is not even okay in my household. But in order for me to get the support I need, I have to do something that requires me to open up to something new. And then the T in HOT is being transparent. So this is when I take that information about how I'm doing, and then I'm open to receiving new information, trying something different. And now I'm showing up and being transparent in that space. So I'm showing up as who I am in that moment with my support network. That can be with my best friend, that can be with my counselor, whoever that person is for you. And it's a daily practice. I've been practicing this for years, and the more I practice it, I don't know if it gets easier. I'm able to see the benefits of it, but it's a challenge to be vulnerable. It's a challenge for me to be hot. But because I know that it's important and it allows me to create these meaningful relationships, I encourage myself and I continue to do it, because now I can pick up my phone if I'm not doing well, and reach out to a friend and actually be honest with them, versus having to always show up as the strong one, having to always show up as Superman or Superwoman. So that's what I would say to that. It takes intentional practice, and shifting our mindset.
So much of what you said resonated with me, especially I grew up in a Dominican Christian household. And my family hasn't felt comfortable with me sharing my experience, and I'm going to be 44 years old. And it's still something that they don't feel comfortable with me doing. And even when I tell my mother that I'm going to talk about it, there are always guidelines with and cannot say. So yeah, I completely understand where you're coming from, but there's also something so powerful about sharing your story. And it's kind of like you're not carrying this burden anymore, right? Like it's okay for you to say it out loud. There's to listen, because you might be able to, encourage someone to also be vulnerable, right?
Did she just cut out for you as well?
Okay, I thought it was me. Yes, she did. She paused. All right, so we'll give her a minute to come back in, I guess.
As we're waiting, I'll touch on one of the things that you mentioned about being honest with yourself just really resonated with me. And that's one of the things that we do with our youth curriculum when we're working with youth and doing training with them around just meaningful connection. We actually start with connecting with yourself and taking that time to actually connect with yourself and reflect on your own well-being. Where are you at? And then, and only then, can you really go out into the world and then have meaningful connection with other people. And that open and transparent pieces, like that has to come after you're already honest and open with yourself about where you're at and how you're doing. So I really, really like that point.
Yeah, and what's so cool about the just checking in with yourself. So I was in a counseling session a few years ago, and my therapist introduced me to a feelings wheel, and this thing blew my mind. And you talk about encouraging young people to tune in and see where they're at emotionally. I had no idea that there were other feelings outside of just being happy and mad, right? And so I'm looking at this feelings wheel, and it says there are feelings like, feeling betrayed, feeling annoyed, feeling defeated, feeling hurt, and as I'm looking at the wheel, I'm able to now have the language to what I'm experiencing versus not even knowing what it is. And that really, not only enhanced my vocabulary, but it helped me to tune in to different emotions that I do feel that I just didn't know, didn't know how to articulate.
I got to imagine that's helped even with your empathy and understanding of other people too, right? Like you start to better understand, like when you're in conversation and the only two emotions that you know are sad or anger, and then like how do you perceive other people in that situation? Like if that's the only lenses you have to look through, right?
Exactly.
Now you start to understand, oh, that person might be feeling betrayed. Like that's a totally different thing. Like how you approach that person now is totally different.
Exactly.
Okay, I have to apologize. I'm sorry. Yeah, I lost connection. Oh my gosh. Okay, I'm back. Okay, and we've just been, we've just been talking. There's so much great information, but I do want to move on because we're running out of time, and I definitely want to talk about warning signs, right? And what are some of the signs that we need to be aware of? And are the signs different for everyone? And what if someone isn't showing warning signs?
Yeah, so I can touch on this. So as I mentioned earlier, I joined I became a QPR suicide prevention gatekeeper instructor with the QPR Institute, and we do a training. And QPR is just another cool acronym that stands for question, persuade, and refer. So when we see someone who is exhibiting different signs or clues that they may be thinking about suicidal or maybe suicidal, or thinking about suicide, we can intervene, right? By asking the question about suicide. Are you suicidal? By persuading them to live and then referring them to different helpful resources. So in that, we talk about different signs. And so we categorize them in three different ways. So there are verbal signs and clues that we can look out for, things that people will say. There are behavioral clues or signs we can look out for, and then situational signs. So for example, hearing someone say, hey, my family would be better off without me. All right, that's a sign that we can listen for to give us that red flag of maybe I should engage in a deeper conversation to see if this person is thinking about suicide. If they say something like, I can't deal with life anymore, right? I just want to end it. I want to go to sleep and never wake up. These are all signs that we can hear. These are verbal signs that we can hear. And then talking about behavioral, if someone is suddenly giving away things that mean or have a lot of significance to them, right? Their most prized possessions, they're giving these things away. This is a clue that we can look out for, because they're thinking in their minds, well, I'm not going to be here any longer, so I might as well give these things away. And that should, alert us to then go deeper in and ask a question and support them in that way. And then situation, I talked about this earlier, but again, just to reiterate, if there's something significant in someone's life and they lose that thing, whether it's a job, a major relationship, or any sort of possession, they no longer have that meant so much to them, that can be a situational sign or clue that they may be thinking about suicide.
The last thing I'll just plug in here on the end is that that's all spot on. There are situations where there aren't signs that you may not see, that may not be red flags. And it's not to say that suicide is behind every corner and every door and you need to go looking for it, but there are so many times where the people that I know who have taken their own lives are the people that you would least expect. And it's the people that didn't have a lot of signs. And in those situations, it just reemphasizes the need to check out on everyone. Abraham, you said the strong people are the Superman and you have to be the Superman in a situation. Like, a lot of times the strongest people I know are the ones that actually have the biggest mental health challenges or experience suicidal ideation regularly. And so you might not even see it from the outside. And so it just reemphasizes the need to check in and have those relationships and check-ins with anyone. Because like you even said earlier too, Abraham, those thoughts can cross through anyone's mind at any time, and it doesn't discriminate.
So once we spot those warning signs, what is the appropriate way to start a conversation, right? How do you start this conversation when you've noticed the warning signs, when you're concerned about someone?
I think the best thing that we all can do is come in curious. Oftentimes we come in with this agenda of what we believe will solve a problem or fix someone or fix something, and we're not curious. And I think if we can all practice listening to understand, it helps us to not only create that space where someone feels empowered to share their experience, but in listening to understand, we will now have the information as to how we can support. So I think, listening to understand is definitely a powerful thing that we all can implement. But if the signs are clear, like I mentioned, some of the signs, that we can listen for, look out for, be aware of. And like Luke mentioned, sometimes there aren't any clear signs. I think being in a position, and I will say, I guess, being courageous enough to ask the question. I talked about earlier how we don't talk about suicide, where the conversation isn't as normalized as it could be. And so we don't even use the word suicide, but by asking someone, hey, are you thinking about suicide? That question just by itself opens up the space for a conversation that otherwise wouldn't happen, right? And I think oftentimes we think, well, if I bring up suicide, then now it's going to plant this idea in their minds to then, kill themselves, which is not the truth. That's one of the biggest misconceptions that exists. Well, if they do say that they are considering suicide, well, I'm not an expert, so I don't want to put myself in that position. Well, anyone can prevent suicide, and you don't have to be an expert to have the conversation. And what it does is when we ask that question and create that safe space to have the conversation, this person now knows this is someone that I can talk to. This is someone that if I am feeling suicidal, maybe they're not feeling suicidal, but if I ever get to that position, I know I can have this conversation with them because they're a safe person. So I think, coming to the conversation curious, like, I just want to know where you're at. I'm going to ask open-ended questions. I'm going to listen to understand and not come with any particular agenda is always a good approach when it comes to supporting someone if we see the signs.
So what are some of those questions that you should ask? I'm sorry to cut you off, Luke. We'll come right back to you. I mean, it's such a difficult topic, right? So like asking someone, are you suicidal? Like, what else can you ask them, to gauge where they are?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so a couple of things that we can do, I think, if we're not comfortable saying the word suicide, which is okay, because again, it's not a conversation that's normalized. We can always work around it, but also create that safe space. So things like, hey, I've noticed that you've been, very unhappy lately. Are you doing okay? I care about you. I care about your well-being. I want to, make sure that you're safe. How have you been doing lately? You don't seem like yourself lately. I've noticed you've been, a little withdrawn. You've been slow to responding. And that's typically not how you operate. Is there something going on? Right? If you were to ask someone, hey, do you ever wish you could go to sleep and never wake up? Right? These are certain questions that we can ask that allows someone who may feel this way, allows them to think to themselves, wow, I could talk about this. I've been thinking these things. I've been imagining these things, but I never knew that I could say them openly. And so if we can help by providing that language and creating that space, and then also letting them know it's okay to feel what you're feeling, right? If you feel so unhappy that you just want to stay in bed, like that is okay, right? And so, I think the biggest thing is just normalizing that we are all experiencing the human experience, which has its ups and has its downs, and we can create conversation around that.
Thank you, Abraham. Luke?
Yeah, I was just going to reinforce what Abraham said about the curiosity and asking open-ended questions. I had the blessing of a really powerful podcast a couple of weeks ago with a mental health professional, and she talked very specifically about calling out, like, I noticed this, tell me more about X, right? Whatever it is, and just asking those kind of digging questions, but also very open-ended, and just coming from a place of caring is so important. The one other thing that I'll just share is, I say this on every platform I get the chance to do it on, don't underestimate the impact you can have. When it comes to, you said that, I forget exactly how you said it, but basically you feel like you need to have all the answers, right? And that isn't always the case. Simply showing up, we have a t-shirt that literally says, show up, be kind, love well. And if you practice those three things in a relationship, in a situation, in those moments, simply just showing up and being there and caring for that person is enough in those moments at that time. And it's not to say that there aren't next steps where they need to get professional help and all those other things. But for the individuals listening, don't underestimate the impact you have by simply just showing up and caring about someone. Because oftentimes that can at least be a really strong starting point, like Abraham said, of they know that you are a reliable person from now on when they're in those situations too.
Thank you, Luke. So thank you both, Abraham and Luke. I know we don't have much time left for Q&A, but I do ask 2 questions from the audience. But before we do, I have one last question for you both. And that is, if I can get my mouse to work, hold on. What are you each doing to help combat the stigma around mental health and give people the resources they need before it's too late? Should I do the alphabetical order again, Abraham?
We can go Luke this time.
Okay.
All right, I'll go first. Yeah, so we just launched, it's actually on my shirt, perfect promo, our project called I Know Lonely, and it really is around destigmatizing loneliness and helping people that might feel lonely feel a little bit less lonely, and then equipping people with resources. I talked about the link earlier of some of the different resources we have. And all of our work around that is, we talked about stories today, is sharing stories and sharing resources of people that have experienced loneliness, that have experienced mental health challenges, and how human connection has played a role in helping those situations.
Thank you, Luke. I also just wanted to say that we're adding all of these links that both Luke and Abraham are mentioning. We're going to add, there they are. miraculously popped up in the chat. So they're in the chat, so you'll be able to click on them and you'll be able to find these resources and tap into them. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, so one of the things that I'm very excited about in terms of the work that I've been able to do, which is something that I never saw myself doing, especially coming from the background that I come from, talking openly about mental health and mental health challenges. I didn't see that coming. So it's funny to see, the types of things and conversations I'm engaged in. But in 2020, I sat down and wrote a book. I mentioned it earlier. It's called Unlearn the Lies, a guide to reshaping the way we think about depression. And what I found in doing speaking engagements and engaging with young people throughout the country is that many of us hold misconceptions, I call them lies, around mental illness or mental health conditions. I remember, there's one chapter in the book that's called Suicide is the Only Way to End Depression. And that was a lie that perpetuated in my mind, that the only way to end what I'm feeling, to end the pain, is to complete suicide. But what I didn't know is that suicide does not end the pain. It transfers that pain to those who are left behind. And so just being able to highlight what some of these misconceptions are, but then also provide practical steps on how we can unlearn these lies, I think is a very powerful tool that I've been able to produce. So there's that. And then with Speaks to Inspire, I mentioned earlier, we marry the art of storytelling with mental health education. So we have a team of speakers who are able to speak for different organizations and schools around the conversation of mental health. How can we have and create these safe spaces, but then also make mental health resources accessible? That's another tool. I also mentioned the QPR training that we offer. This is a tool that we try to share and educate as much as possible, because like I mentioned earlier, suicide is the most preventable death, right? And the more we can equip people with the tools to identify the signs and intervene, if they see these signs, the more we're able to prevent suicide. Because a lot of people who feel suicidal, it's that they feel, alone. They feel like no one, understands. They feel like, in crying out for help, no one cares enough to support them. And oftentimes people do recognize some signs, but don't have the confidence to say anything. And so with this training, we're able to give practical tools to teach others how to ask the question, how to persuade someone to stay alive, and then how to, and what resources to refer them to. So those are a few things that we're currently working on.
Thank you so much. And thank you for both of you for all that you're doing to end the loneliness epidemic, also to break down the stigma of mental health, and for sharing your stories. We are going to share a slide with resources, and unfortunately, we don't have much time, so I am going to ask one question from the audience, and then we are going to say goodbye. Okay, so I have one question here, and it's from, sorry. Okay, this is from Trish. I think often people who are depressed do not have the energy to reach out for help. Is there anything you can say to help encourage to reach out for help? Like advertisements.
I caught the first part of the question, but you
want me to read it again? Did I
Yeah.
freeze? My Wi-Fi has been so wonky. I'm so sorry. Trish asked or said, how often, I think often people who are depressed do not have the energy to reach out for help. Is there anything anyone can say or do to encourage them to reach out for help?
Yeah, one thing I always like to share is when someone is struggling mentally and we want to support that person, sometimes we have to do more, or most times we have to do more. So that persistence of checking in, understanding it's only 7 seconds, like Luke mentioned, but the consistency of that ultimately helps or can help that person to recognize mental health support will be helpful for me. Because like the question said, those who are dealing with mental health challenges, most times the energy isn't there, the motivation isn't there. Maybe there isn't any hope that help would even be helpful. And so those who are supporting, we sometimes have to take on more of that work and that load, because it can be very difficult. So I would just say the persistence of, checking in, providing resources like what's on the screen. Anyone can call or text the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline to talk to someone for free. 24/7 is just 988, and you can speak to someone at any time of the day. So being able to share these practical resources on a consistent basis, I think, ultimately is helpful.
Yeah.
I know, sorry, I know that we're over time, but I do want to stay on for just a couple more minutes. So for those that do have to, like I mentioned earlier, we're recording this event. There's going to be recording and a recap of this event on our blog at meetup.com/blog. You'll be able to access it by next week, and we will include all of the links mentioned throughout this conversation will be included in there. So if you have to log off, you understand. But I did want to ask one more question. And Luke, were you going to add something to what Abraham just said?
I was just going to say, you might not see the return on investment right away, right? You might be the one putting in that effort, and you might not hear back from that person. You might not know the impact that you're having by simply texting or calling every day or two, checking in. You might not see that return on investment right away, but you don't know the impact that that might be having, just them knowing that you have their back. And so just because they don't respond to you or don't get back in touch with you right away, doesn't mean that you're not having an impact, and continue to persist, like Abraham said.
Thank you, Luke. We're talking about the person, who's looking out for these warning signs, who's trying to help loved one or their friend, or their spouse. So I just wanted to ask, how do you as that person take care of yourself as well while you're doing that?
That's such a great point. And I think we have to remember self-care is essential. And if we're not taking care of ourselves, the question then becomes how effective are we in our support really? So I think, if I could share any, advice or insight, it's what are those things that when you engage in it, it helps you to feel relaxed or refreshed or unplugged. So things like, for me personally, going out to the nature trail, walking outside, exercising, making sure that I'm drinking my water, right? Eating healthy foods, engaging in hot conversations. And I got to reiterate this because for me specifically, being honest, open, transparent, vulnerable, all these things, this doesn't come naturally and it's very difficult, but there's always a benefit when I allow myself to be seen, to be heard, right? And whether I'm doing that in a counseling session with my therapist, or I'm doing that with my wife, I'm doing that with my best friend, or on this session with you all, there's always something powerful and refreshing that comes from being vulnerable. So I encourage myself to have hot conversations regularly. So those are just some things, that I engage in to help me to be in the best position I could be to then help someone else.
Yeah, and the other thing I would add to that is just that counseling isn't just because you're experiencing a mental health crisis, right? And I think going to counseling is something that or therapy is something that I recommend for everyone, regardless of where your mental health journey is right now. It's something that we encourage regularly for myself, our employees here, everyone that I interact with, I encourage it, irregardless of where you're experiencing your mental health state at that time, because it really equips you and helps you, even if you're the one reaching out and having to be the strong one in that moment. Again, none of this discriminates, and you don't know if there's down the road, you might experience depression or you might experience anxiety, and having that consistent counseling or therapy is really helpful for when those times come.
Thank you both. I would agree with what you both said. Just a little bit about me again. So a conversation with my therapist about the conversation that we were going to have today. And it was very important that I practice self-care today so that just was very aware of how I was feeling to make sure that this conversation wasn't triggering And it wasn't. So thank you both so much for making it so, such a great, helpful, impactful, and just thoughtful conversation. And we are time. Thank you so much, Luke and Abraham, for joining us today and for everything that you shared and everything that you're doing. I just wanted to say again to anyone that's still on here, if you want to catch a recording and a recap of this event, you can on our blog /blog. And all the links that were mentioned and shared be in the blog as well. And again, thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you all for being here.
Have a great day, everyone.